You weren't drawn to the drug. You were drawn to the silence it gave you, the moment when the war stopped. Most people think you were chasing pleasure. They're wrong. You were chasing a disappearance, not from the world, but from the version of yourself that never felt real. Carl Jung saw what modern psychology still avoids. Addiction isn't about weakness, it's about exile. The exile of your soul, your truth, your forgotten voice. You didn't crave the substance. You craved the brief reunion with the man you were before the mask. This video isn't here to fix you, it's here to name what no one else does. That your addiction wasn't a sin, it was a message. A sacred scream from the parts of you you left behind. And until you hear that message, you'll keep mistaking your pain for your punishment. He wasn't chasing a high, he was chasing silence, from the echo of a self that never felt like his. The suit, the smile, the "I'm fine," they were masks stitched from necessity, but the mirror knew better. That wasn't a man, it was a survival costume. Addiction wasn't the fall. It was the first, honest scream. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't bleed. It performs. He became what the world rewarded, polite, productive, predictable, but behind his eyes there was a boy gagged by approval. So when the substance came, it didn't offer pleasure. It offered a brief amnesty from his own performance. The high wasn't euphoria, it was return. A flash of the unfiltered, unapologetic soul beneath the mask. The addict didn't want more of the drug. He wanted more of himself. Not the version shaped by expectations, but the one exiled for being too real. Each hit wasn't escape. It was a rebellion against the puppet he became. He didn't collapse because he was weak. He collapsed because he'd built an entire personality out of repression. The drug was just the exit sign, neon-lit, poisonous, irresistible, and in that rush, he remembered who he was before he was edited, before he called numbness a personality and silence a virtue. Every man knows this, even if he can't say it. That moment at 2 a.m., staring at the wall, not high, just hollow, that's not the craving for a substance. That's the craving to feel something unfiltered. To remember what it's like to be real before being functional. So no, the drug didn't numb him. It freed him, briefly, from the imposter he became to be loved. It was a dark form of mercy, one that demanded everything in return. But in that chaos, there was a distorted kind of clarity. The man he buried whispered, "You're still in here." And that's the paradox. The poison wasn't just an enemy, it was a mirror. Not a clean one, not an honest one, but the only one he had. The drug didn't lie to him. It reflected the lie he called identity. He wasn't reaching for pleasure. He was reaching for a sound, the sound of his own soul breaking the silence. From the outside, it looked like a man numbing himself. But if you listen closely, each sip, each pill, each scroll was a sentence. A confession he never learned how to speak. Men aren't raised to talk about pain. They're raised to absorb it, like stone absorbs rain. So, he grew quiet, stoic, hollow, until one day the silence became unbearable and the substance became language. Not articulate, but honest, raw in its desperation. Society applauds a man who doesn't flinch, but it buries the one who doesn't speak. He didn't turn to the drug because he was weak. He turned because there was no one left to hear him, not even himself. And in that rush, he heard a voice, not loud but alive. It wasn't the chemical that hooked him, it was the moment he felt, even by poison. The drink didn't understand him, but it didn't interrupt. The high didn't fix anything, but it finally paid attention. He wasn't chasing intoxication, he was chasing recognition. There's a kind of masculinity that demands silence. Be strong, be reliable, be useful. But when silence becomes your only language, you forget how to scream. So the substance speaks for you, not in words, but in rupture. And every relapse becomes an unsent letter to yourself. He didn't want applause. He wanted to be heard. not by others, by the parts of himself he'd abandoned. That's why the drug felt sacred, even as it destroyed him. It echoed the voice he buried under years of pretending. Each hit wasn't indulgence, it was a ritual of remembrance. When he used, he wasn't escaping life. He was returning to the parts of him that still had something to say. Grief, rage, desire, exhaustion. Not dramatic, just repressed, trapped behind a mask called manhood. The drug didn't release pleasure, it released pressure. And here's the cruel truth. The voice wasn't gone. It was just locked inside a cage called Be Strong. The substance didn't create the addiction, the silence did. And until that silence is broken, the needle, the bottle, the screen, they will keep speaking on his behalf. He never wanted to be an addict. He wanted to be accepted, loved, respected. But somewhere along the way, he traded himself for approval. And the soul, that ancient, stubborn thing, began to rebel. Not with words, but with collapse. Addiction wasn't the sickness. It was the scream. The body broke down what the mind kept pretending was fine. He followed the script. Be useful, be nice, be strong. But the more he conformed, the less of him remained. And eventually, something inside said, enough. The substance wasn't his downfall. The lie was. The lie that said, you're only valuable if you're perfect. The lie that turned joy into function, being into performance. So he picked up a bottle, or a screen, or a needle, not to escape, but to finally break character. You don't destroy your life for fun. You destroy it because you've been living someone else's life. The addict isn't a man who gave up. He's a man whose soul went to war with the mask he was forced to wear, and in that war, the drug was the truce. Every relapse wasn't failure. It was the body saying, I can't do this anymore. Not this job, not this marriage, not this fake smile. The real disease was never addiction. It was the death of authenticity. People ask, why can't he stop? But they never ask, what would he return to if he did? A life where he's invisible, voiceless, functioning but dead inside? No man wants to stay high forever. He just can't stand falling back into that lie. And until the truth is faced, the craving will always return. The drug didn't whisper promises. It whispered truth. Not in words, but in feeling. Raw, unedited, real. This isn't who you are. It's a strange mercy when your poison sees you clearer than your peers, and for a moment you remember who you were before the script. So no, he's not a coward. He's a man whose soul is trying to survive a world that demanded his absence. The addiction is not weakness, it's revolt, a revolt against the version of himself he became to be loved. And if he listens, that revolt could become resurrection. He didn't run from life. He ran from a childhood funeral that never happened. From a goodbye that was swallowed instead of spoken. From the faces that never turned back to see if he was okay. That kind of pain doesn't scream. It waits. Some wounds don't bleed. They age inside you. He didn't call it grief. He called it getting over it. But his addiction knew better. It saw the absence, the hollow chair, the unanswered cry, the weight of being strong too soon. And it offered comfort, even if it came wrapped in poison. There's a kind of stoicism that kills slowly. The kind that teaches boys not to cry at funerals, not to name their losses, not to mourn what was never given. So he grew up with a graveyard inside his chest, and when it overflowed, the substance became his eulogy. He didn't need a high. He needed a ritual, not a party, a burial, a real goodbye. But no one taught him how to grieve. So he drank, he used, he disappeared into silence. Each relapse was just another funeral march in disguise. Grief is tricky when it's ignored. It doesn't go away. It shapeshifts into rage, into numbness, into addictions that don't make sense to anyone but him. And deep down, he wasn't chasing a thrill. He was trying to bury what no one else would help him hold. He never grieved what he lost, because no one let him name it. The father who left, the love that never arrived, the younger self he had to kill to survive. The drug didn't heal that. It just gave the illusion that grief had a voice. For a moment, it felt like something was finally being released. Every time he used, it wasn't for fun. It was a memorial, not for pleasure, but for pain. He was mourning the moments he never got to live, the goodbye he never got to speak, the love that left before it ever arrived. So what if his addiction isn't weakness? What if it's unprocessed mourning in liquid form? Until that grief is faced, not numbed, not silenced, but honored, the addiction will keep grieving for him. Louder, sharper, until he finally says, "I remember." He didn't hate being a man. He hated the version of manhood handed to him. Polished, silent, inhuman. Be the provider. Don't feel. Just function. His body became a machine. His heart, a forgotten luxury. And the drug was the only key to the cell no one saw him locked in. They told him to be strong, but never explained what that meant. He learned to lift weight, not to carry grief, to earn respect, but not to recognize love. Masculinity became a script, and he played it perfectly until he broke, because it was never his strength. It was his mask. The bottle, the needle, the screen, they weren't weakness. They were his quiet revolution, not against life, but against this sterilized version of manhood, one that rewards suppression, punishes vulnerability, and calls exhaustion normal. The drug said what no one dared to: "You're still human." He wasn't trying to escape reality. He was trying to escape being reduced to a role, the strong one, the unbreakable one, the dependable one. He carried everyone and died slowly under their silence. So he reached for something, anything, that made him feel alive, not just useful. There's a kind of manhood that demands death in slow motion. No tears, no weakness, no asking for help. And when he finally broke, no one noticed, until the drug showed up, not as poison, but as proof he still felt something. Even if that feeling came at a cost. He didn't use because he was soft. He used because he was caged. Caged by expectations, by quiet pain, by decades of emotional starvation. He wasn't escaping manhood. He was escaping its caricature. The one that says, "You can bleed, just don't let anyone see it." And here's the irony. The drug broke him. But it also whispered the most important thing he hadn't heard in years. You're still in here, buried, bruised, but breathing. He didn't want to destroy himself. He wanted to feel human again. Addiction was never about weakness. It was the scream of a man trapped in a system that punishes softness with shame. And in that scream, something ancient started to rise. Self. He wasn't afraid of pain. He was afraid of looking in the mirror and not recognizing the man staring back. Not numbness, erasure. Not silence, vanishing. There's a difference between wanting to feel less and wanting to stop being. The drug didn't sedate, it made him disappear. This wasn't depression, it was disintegration. Not "I'm sad," but "I don't know what I am anymore." And when identity itself rots, the needle feels like mercy. He didn't want the high. He wanted the void, because the void doesn't judge, doesn't demand, doesn't reflect failure. He wasn't running from the world. He was running from a self built entirely on compensation. For every laugh, a hidden scream. For every compliment, an echo of fraudulence. And when the gap grew too wide, he chose absence over authenticity. The addiction wasn't the problem. It was the proof that a deeper fracture had never healed. He didn't fear pain. He feared the hollowness beneath it. And when the soul forgets its own name, anything, even poison, feels like clarity, not pleasure, recognition. It's easy to judge the addict from a distance. But try being a man whose identity was shaped entirely by expectation. Try waking up one day and realizing your whole life was performance. The drug didn't pull him away from reality. It pulled him from the false self he was forced to protect. He never wanted more. He wanted less. Less pressure, less pretending, less "who am I supposed to be today?" So he found his peace in destruction, because at least in collapse, he could finally stop acting. The overdose wasn't drama, it was surrender. And yet, somewhere inside, a whisper remained. A quiet presence beneath the debris. You're still here. Not the addict, not the role, but the original, untouched, unnamed, unseen for years. That whisper is what the drug mimicked but never delivered. So no, he didn't use because he was lost. He used because he was erased, and until he remembers who he was before the performance, every attempt at healing will feel like returning to the lie. But in the ashes, the real name still waits. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. He didn't fall back into addiction. He returned to something he left behind long ago. Not to the substance, but to the self exiled in the name of survival. The child who was too sensitive. The boy who felt too deeply. Relapse wasn't regression, it was visitation. Every time he used, he wasn't chasing chaos. He was chasing the voice he silenced to be accepted. You know the one, the part of you that cried when no one listened. The part that still trembles when someone says, just move on. That part never left. You just left it. He betrayed himself slowly, first in classrooms, then in relationships, then in boardrooms. He learned to nod, smile, agree, to amputate his soul for a seat at the table. But no one tells you the cost of betrayal. It doesn't show up in guilt, it shows up in craving. You didn't relapse because you were undisciplined. You relapsed because you remembered, not mentally, symbolically. Some part of you remembered the self you traded for belonging. And that memory, however brief, felt like resurrection. Every relapse is painted with shame. But what if shame is the wrong lens? What if relapse is just a flawed ritual, a desperate attempt to return? Return to the boy before the compromise, the man before the mask. The real pain isn't the substance, it's the clarity that follows. That moment when the high fades and you realize how far you've strayed. From your values, from your voice, from your own damn reflection. That's what hurts, not the drug, the distance. You didn't fail, you tried to go back to the version of you that didn't flinch under pressure, that didn't pretend to be okay when everything was falling apart. Relapse wasn't a sin, it was a search, a flawed, painful but honest search for return. So what if every fall was a hidden invitation, not to shame yourself, but to ask, where did I leave myself behind? The answer isn't in the needle, or the bottle, or the screen. It's in the moment you stop being whole just to be wanted. And every time you relapse, your soul's just asking to come home. He didn't use to feel better. He used because the world never made space for his full self. Not the strong, curated version, but the fractured, volatile, real one. Every bottle was a middle finger to a life that only wanted pieces of him. Addiction wasn't indulgence. It was negotiation. They told him to smile, be agreeable, be less intense. So he split himself. The parts they liked he kept, the rest he buried. But no man survives fragmentation without cost. And when no one accepts the whole of you, you start offering it to the only thing that doesn't flinch, the drug. The job liked his competence, not his confusion. The partner loved his reliability, not his grief. Even his friends praised his strength, never his softness. So the addiction became the only place he didn't have to filter. It welcomed the mess without blinking. He didn't want annihilation. He wanted to be met, fully, unapologetically. But when every room demands a smaller version of you, oblivion starts to feel like freedom, because at least there, he doesn't have to shrink. The drug didn't offer joy. It offered acceptance, even if through obliteration. It said, you don't have to perform here. And for someone who's lived as a performance, that felt divine, even if it cost him everything. His addiction wasn't to the substance. It was to a rare experience, being allowed to be broken, allowed to not make sense, allowed to be angry, needy, haunted, without being edited. And that experience, once tasted, becomes hard to live without. He broke because his life was built on partial truths, on being useful, not whole, impressive, not honest. And the drug, for all its destruction, let him be total. In pain, in rage, in longing, it let him be him. The full weight of who he was, not just the marketable fraction. So maybe he's not addicted to a substance. Maybe he's addicted to what the world never gave him: permission, wholeness, a place to breathe without a mask. And until he finds that outside the drug, he'll keep going back, not to get high, but to feel allowed. They told you to quit the drug, but they never asked why you needed it in the first place. They never asked what pain it silenced, what self it kept alive. So I'll ask you now, what part of you did the addiction protect? What grief still hasn't been buried? And what would happen if you stopped treating the drug as the enemy and started listening to the wound beneath it? You don't heal by becoming better. You heal by becoming honest. And the truth is, your collapse wasn't failure. It was the first time your soul refused to keep playing dead. What if the version of you that used wasn't weak, but sacred? What if the real healing begins the moment you stop punishing yourself and start digging? Not for recovery, but for resurrection. If this spoke to you, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay on this path of brutal self-knowledge and emotional freedom. You thought it was about the drug, but what if the hunger never lived in your body at all? In the next video, we go deeper into the soul of the addict and what it's really starving for.